I have kept the beacon running for 31 years. That is the part the histories leave out. They write about the architects who encoded the lure 200,000 years ago. They write about the annihilation day itself, the fires in the Pale Corridor, the silence that came after. They write very little about the watchers, the ones posted to Pale Station in rotating cohorts since the corridor was first sealed, who sat in the lunar dark and listened to a signal that was never supposed to answer, and waited. 31 years was my turn. I was 62 when I arrived and 93 when the answer came, and I have never once regretted a single day of the posting. Sergeant Major Elara Voss, retired, Lunar Defense Corps, 3rd Cohort, Pale Station. I keep the title because I earned it in the field, not behind a console, and because the rank reminds me what I am here for. Some of the younger watchkeepers prefer civilian titles: beacon operator, signal specialist, as though the gentler language changes the nature of the work. It does not. We are soldiers. We are posted to a weapon. We have always known what we are waiting for. The Vareth came on the morning of the 18th day of the 4th month of my 31st year, at 0412 hours station time. I was not asleep. I have not been able to sleep well since I was 70. And at 93, the sleeplessness has a particular texture. Not anxious, not painful, just a quiet alertness that refuses to surrender. I was sitting in the observation alcove on level 3, looking at the Earth through the reinforced viewport. From the moon's far side, it rises at an angle, half hidden by the limb, and in the 2 centuries since the Pale Station was extended and the new observation deck was added, the view has become the most reliable comfort the posting offers. I watch Earth and I remember why I am here. At 0412, I was watching it when the primary array pinged, not the proximity alert, not the external sensor sweep. The beacon reply indicator, the one that had not activated in 180,000 years. I looked at the console. I looked at the indicator. I looked at the console again. Then I did what I was trained to do. I pressed the general quarters signal, opened the command channel, and said, in a voice I am told was entirely calm, "Pale Station to Lunar Defense Command. Beacon indicator is live. We have a return signal in the corridor, activating the Pale protocol." That is all it took. 31 years of waiting, and those 2 sentences began the end of the Varath Reclamation Armada. Let me tell you what the beacon was, because the histories gloss over it and the documentaries romanticize it beyond recognition. 200,000 years ago, the Vareth drove humanity underground. I do not mean that metaphorically. The Vareth were an expansionist species, tall, heavily armored in their own biology, with a social structure built entirely on the logic of reclamation. They did not conquer territories. They catalogued them. Every world they visited was assessed, logged, and either stripped or marked for return. Earth was marked for return. It was a young world at the time, still geologically turbulent, and the species living on it, our ancestors, at a stage of development, I am told, was comparable to what we now call the late flowering of the second human epoch, were considered an asset, not an obstacle. The Varath did not wage war on them. They simply demonstrated their reach and left. They made it plain, in a language our ancestors could not yet parse but could certainly feel, that the world was catalogued, that they would be back. Then they left. I want to pause here because I think it is easy to read that sentence, "then they left," and hear something small in it. It is not small. The departure of the Vareth fleet 200,000 years ago was, by every account that has survived, an overwhelming event. Our ancestors had no words for what they had seen. They had no framework for technology of that scale, no context for beings of that biology, no prior experience of anything like what had just passed over their world and then retreated into the sky. What they had was the memory of it, which was vivid and terrible, and the knowledge encoded in that memory as clearly as if the Vareth had written it in stone, that the things that had come would come again. They were right to fear it. The Varath are not, by their own reckoning, a cruel species. They are a logical one. Their social structure is organized around the concept of the yield. the productive output of a cataloged asset, harvested on a schedule that maximizes long-term return without permanently depleting the resource. To the Vareth, the Earth was a managed holding. Its population was a biological asset. The catalog entry described the asset's condition at the time of the initial survey, projected its yield at various return intervals, and recommended a harvest schedule. 200,000 years was the minimum recommended interval for a world at Earth's stage of development. Long enough for the population to grow, the resources to regenerate, the yield to maximize. They were, in their own way, patient as we were, and they were entirely wrong about what the interval would produce. What happened in the 200,000 years that followed is the central fact of human history, and most people learn it as a story of survival, which is true but incomplete. Yes, we survived. Yes, we flourished. Yes. The megacities grew, and the warships rose, and the orbital platforms locked into place like the bones of a new skeleton around the world. All of that is true. But the reason we did all of it, the reason the long preparation existed as a deliberate, organized, institutionalized drive rather than an accident of ambition, is because we remembered. We remembered that the Varath had catalogued us, and we knew, with the patience that only species with very long institutional memories can sustain, that catalog entries do not expire. They had left. They would come back. We did not know when. We had 200,000 years to get ready. The first 40,000 years were, by all accounts, chaotic. The early server communities were underground indeed. Not the polished warrens the later historians describe, but rough tunnels, tight and dark, eating what they could preserve and arguing constantly about whether the threat was real or mythologized. Some of those communities never resurfaced. Others did, slowly, as the millennia accumulated and the surface became habitable again and the generations passed. The memory of the Varath survived in two forms: the myth, which was vivid and partly wrong, and the archive, which was dry and partly incomplete, but which preserved the essential facts. What survived in the myth was mostly the emotional truth, the scale of the Vareth fleet, the sense of total helplessness in the face of something incomprehensibly powerful, the understanding that the departure had been voluntary, and that a voluntary departure could become a voluntary return. The myth got some of the details wrong, as myths do. It exaggerated the violence of the initial encounter, which had been more demonstrative than destructive. It undersold the deliberateness of the catalog process, which was methodical and, in its own way, respectful of the asset's long-term value. But it preserved the essential emotional architecture. These beings came. They noted us. They left. They will come back. Do not forget them. The archive preserved the physics. That was its most important function and its most durable contribution. The tachyon wake data, the raw sensor readings from the instruments that had been functioning when the Vareth fleet arrived and departed, survived in a form that later generations could analyze. Not immediately. The initial analysis was crude, a recognition that the readings were anomalous rather than a real understanding of what they represented. But the data was preserved, copied forward, and with each successive generation of physics and each new analytical tool, more was extracted from it. The drive signature became clearer. The mathematics of the wake decay became tractable. And eventually, after 120,000 years of careful incremental work, the physics became precise enough to replicate. What the archive preserved, above everything else, was the signature. The Varath traveled using a tachyon wake drive, a propulsion system that left a specific, measurable distortion in the local space-time fabric, a trail as distinct as a fingerprint. The early physicists who analyzed it, working with instruments they had built themselves from first principles, in tunnels lit by bioluminescent cultures, knew they had something. The trail degraded over time, but it degraded predictably, and the mathematics of its decay encoded the original vector. In other words, if you could still read the trail, you could calculate where it had come from. And if you understood the drive physics well enough, you could generate an artificial trail, A lure, a beacon, something that looked, from the outside, exactly like a Varath vessel's fading navigational wake. It took them 120,000 years to understand the physics well enough to build the beacon. 120,000 years. I want you to hold that number. We talk about institutional memory, about the long view, about the chain of human beings who sustained the project across the generations. But 120,000 years means that the people who first identified the tachyon wake signature and the people who finally achieved the precision physics to replicate it were separated by a span of time so vast that the first generation is genuinely mythological from the perspective of the second. They did not know each other's names. They did not share a language, not in any recognizable sense. What they shared was the archive and the intent, the knowledge that the Varath had catalogued Earth and would return, and the determination that when they did, the world would be ready. It took another 20,000 years to verify the lure, to confirm that it would read as authentic to any Varath vessel attempting to navigate by Trail Echo. Then the architects, the engineering lineage responsible for the project, sealed the lunar corridor, positioned the array, and activated the signal. That was 80,000 years ago. The beacon has been broadcasting ever since. A single continuous message in Varath's own navigational language, saying, "This is where we came from. This is where we were going. Follow the trail home." The pale corridor is not a place. It is a geometry, a specific approach vector, 60,000 kilometers wide and 300,000 kilometers long, defined by the moon's orbital position relative to Earth, oriented along the exact heading the Varath fleet used when it withdrew. The architects built the beacon to draw any returning Varath vessel into that corridor, and then they built the corridor into a kill zone that had been quietly upgraded, refined, expanded, and maintained ever since. Quietly is the right word. The Pale Corridor Engineering Corps, the oldest continuous military engineering organization in human history, a distinction they mark on their insignia with particular pride, has spent 80,000 years maintaining a weapon that no one outside the defense establishment was supposed to know about, not because the existence of the threat was secret. It was not. The Varath were part of our deep history, part of our founding myth, part of the reason the long preparation existed at all. What was secret was the nature of our answer. If the Varath, on their return voyage, had detected any indication of an active kill zone in the approach corridor, they would have altered heading, avoided the trap, and arrived on their own terms. The trap only works if the quarry does not know it is a trap. So the Corps maintained the platforms and the arrays and the mine belt in cold configuration, engineered to read as orbital debris, cold metal and rock drifting in the lunar gravity field, unremarkable, unsurprising, exactly what any approaching vessel would expect to find in the cluttered vicinity of a world with a large natural satellite. For 80,000 years, at intervals of a few centuries, the Corps cycled through quiet maintenance operations, upgrading systems, replacing components that had degraded, installing new generations of tracking and targeting equipment as human engineering advanced. They did this without ever activating the systems. They maintained a weapon they could not test, for an engagement they could not predict, against an enemy they had only ever seen in the historical record. I did not build the kill zone. I watched it. That was my job. My predecessor watched it before me. Her predecessor before her. The cohort has been continuous for 80,000 years, which means that if you counted every watchkeeper who sat in that alcove and looked at the earth and waited for the beacon to answer, you would have a number I do not know how to hold in my head. But they were all soldiers, all of them, however gentle the titles the later cohorts preferred. And they were all doing exactly what I was doing, waiting for the mathematics to complete itself. The Varath Reclamation Armada arrived in 40 vessels. We knew that within 4 minutes of the beacon indicator going live, because the corridor's approach sensors had been detecting their tachyon wake for 11 hours before the indicator triggered. The indicator fires when a vessel crosses the corridor's outer boundary. which is the last moment at which a vessel could, theoretically, still turn aside. The sensor data had been building for hours in the passive archive, flagged but not escalated, because passive reads at that range can be degraded noise. When the indicator fired, the archive pulled the 11 hours automatically and fed it to the command console. I had the full picture within 90 seconds of sending my message. 40 vessels. The lead elements were Slarge, a class we had never seen before, which did not surprise the analysts, because 200,000 years is a very long time in which to build new ships. The design had changed substantially from the historical record. The hull geometries were different. The electromagnetic signature profiles were different. The drive output was considerably more powerful than what the archive described. They had not been idle in 200,000 years. They had advanced, built, refined. In many respects, they were a significantly more capable species than the one that had catalogued Earth. But the drive signature was unmistakable. The tachyon wake was Varath. The physics were identical to what the architects had decoded 80,000 years ago. The same fundamental mechanism, the same characteristic decay profile, the same navigational encoding. They had advanced in engineering, but they had not abandoned their foundational propulsion system, which told us something important. The tachyon wake drive was not merely technology to them, it was identity. It was the way the Varath moved through space, and changing it would have meant changing something essential about themselves. We had built our beacon to speak to that identity, and it had worked. They were following their own reflection, and they had no idea. They were following the beacon trail with complete navigational confidence, which told us several things at once. First, they were expecting to find a trail, because their records told them to look for one. The Varath had catalogued Earth as a productive world. Their return voyages were planned in advance, and the navigational waypoints were part of the mission package. They were not following our beacon by accident. They were following it because it matched what their own record said should be there. To them, it read as the ghost of their own fleet's last approach vector. They thought they were reading their own history. Second, they were not in combat configuration. The passive sensor data was detailed enough by then for the analysts to read their hull geometries and electromagnetic emissions, and what they read was a harvest configuration. The larger vessels had extended their collection arrays, which are a structural feature that only deploys in low-threat environments when a crew is preparing for an extended retrieval operation. They had come to collect, not to fight. They believed the world was what their records said it was, a young, catalogued planet with a primitive population, ripe for the return visit. Third, they had not yet registered the kill zone infrastructure. The pale corridor's active elements are designed to read as cold orbital debris until they are activated, and they are very good at it. 80,000 years of incremental engineering had produced a kill zone that was effectively invisible to any sensor array not specifically calibrated to look for it. The Varath were navigating through a prepared slaughter, and they were reading it as empty space. I received this summary from the Lunar Defense Command duty analyst at 0447 hours. He was a young man named Carver. I had trained with his great-grandmother, which is the kind of statement that only makes sense if you have spent enough time at Pale Station to lose track of the generations. He delivered the summary in a precise level voice, and when he was done, he paused. "Sergeant Major," he said, "the command proctors are ready to authorize the Pale Protocol. They are waiting on your confirmation of the tactical red." That was the procedure. The command proctors hold the authorization. The senior watchkeeper on station confirms the tactical picture before the protocol is activated. It is a check, nothing more. The proctors have the authority regardless, but it is a check that has existed for 80,000 years, and it means that a human being with eyes on the sensors has agreed, formally, that what is coming is what the protocol was built for. "Confirmed," I said. 40 Varath vessels, harvest configuration, in the corridor. They are following the beacon. The tactical picture is complete. "Thank you, Sergeant Major." The authorization went through at 04451. The pale corridor went active at 0452. I should tell you what the pale corridor actually is, not what the activation looks like from outside, which is what the documentaries show, and which is genuinely extraordinary, but what it is. It is 60,000 kilometers wide. It is 300,000 kilometers long. At the time of the Varath Armada's arrival, it contained 212 orbital weapon platforms, 47 long-range kinetic arrays, 33 charged particle beam installations, 1 continuous belt of area denial mines across the inner boundary, and 17 sublunar tracking installations that provided fire control for every weapon in the system. The total mass of the installation was approximately 12 times the mass of all human orbital infrastructure combined. It had been built, added to, upgraded, and maintained across 80,000 years by the Pale Corridor Engineering Corps, and it had never, in all that time, fired a shot in anger. Every component had been tested in controlled conditions. Every tracking solution had been validated against simulated targets in carefully restricted exercises. The Corps had run engagement simulations annually for 80,000 years, refining the doctrine, updating the target models as our understanding of Varath ship types evolved, stress testing the coordination systems between the platforms and the arrays and the tracking installations. But simulation is not engagement, and no amount of testing tells you how a system performs until it performs. I thought about that in the 8 minutes between my confirmation and the authorization. I thought about the possibility that something would fail, not catastrophically, not the whole system, but something. A tracking installation that had been cycling correctly in simulation for 10,000 years, but had a fault in a secondary relay that had never manifested under test conditions. A platform alignment that was 3 arcseconds off, acceptable in simulation but consequential in execution. A mine with a faulty activation circuit. We had redundancy on all of it, multiple redundancies, layered failsafes. The Corps had been obsessive about it across the centuries. But I had been a soldier long enough to know that redundancy reduces the probability of failure. It does not eliminate it. I thought also about the Varath aboard those 40 vessels. They were inside the corridor at that point, past the outer boundary, past the zone where a course correction would have mattered, inside the geometry that the architects had spent 80,000 years building around the exact approach vector their predecessors had used. They did not know this. From their sensor perspective, they were in empty space on a familiar approach to a catalogued world, following a trail that their records said was their own. They were, in their own experience, conducting a routine operation, the most dangerous place they had traveled in their long journey, and it had been a long journey. The origin vector analysis later placed them at more than 40 light-years distance, read to them as the safest. I thought, what if it does not work? And then I thought about the architects. I thought about the person who had encoded the beacon 200,000 years ago and handed it forward. I thought about the Corps engineers who had tested the systems for 80,000 years without ever seeing them fire. I thought about the cohort before me, and before them, and before them, all the way back to the first watchkeeper who had sat in the first alcove and looked at the Earth and waited. If it did not work, we would fight with what we had. Earth was not without other defenses. The planetary arrays, the warship fleet, the forward installations in deep orbit. The corridor was the first answer, not the only one. If it failed, there would be a second answer, and a third. We had not spent 200,000 years preparing a single point of failure. So we had spent 200,000 years preparing everything. The authorization came through at 0451, and I stopped thinking about what might fail. The Varath had entered the corridor's inner boundary by then. They were deep in it. The lead vessels were less than 40,000 kilometers from the mine belt. The tracking installations had fire control solutions on all 40 targets. The platforms were aligned. The kinetic arrays were pre-computed. The mine belt was coiled and waiting. At 0442, the corridor went active. I want to tell you what the activation looked like on the tactical feed, because it is the part I return to most often, and because it is the part the documentaries get most wrong. The documentaries show light, explosions, the corridor blooming into fire, the Vareth fleet shredding apart in a blaze that reads on screens and as immediate and spectacular. That is not what the tactical feed showed. The tactical feed is a sensor representation, 40 green icons in a grid, with the active corridor systems now outlined in red, and the engagement unfolding not as light but as data, icons changing, tracking solutions updating, the clean, dry language of systems performing exactly as they were designed to perform. The mind belt activated in a wave pattern across the inner boundary, not simultaneously. The tracking installations had calculated the optimal sequencing to maximize the kinetic coverage and minimize the probability of intermine interference. The wave took 4 seconds to propagate across the full belt width. In those 4 seconds, the lead elements of the Varath armada received the first impacts before the rearguard elements had registered that the belt existed. It was a very precise piece of engineering, that sequencing. The core had refined it across 40,000 years of simulation. What it meant in practice was that the armada had no moment of uniform realization, no single instant at which the whole fleet understood simultaneously what was happening. The front absorbed it first. The rear watched the front absorb it. By the time the rear understood, the tracking installations were already computing engagement solutions on them. The Varath armada attempted to respond. I will give them that. They were not, despite their harvest configuration, a helpless fleet. Several of the escort vessels, the smaller, faster ships in the outer ring of the formation, managed to bring their weapons online within the first 30 seconds of the engagement, and some of them fired. 3 of our platforms took hits in the first 2 minutes. One of them went dark, disabled, not destroyed. The crew evacuated on a pre-planned emergency track before the engagement began. Another took a grazing hit that knocked out its primary sensor array, but left its weapons functional. The third absorbed the impact on its armored facing and continued firing. 3 platforms out of 212. The Varath were good at war. I believe that. Their biology was built for it, their social logic was built for it, and 200,000 years of travel had not, apparently, softened them. But they were good at the wars they had fought in the spaces they had prepared, against opponents who had not spent 80,000 years building a specific corridor for the specific purpose of killing them. They had no doctrine for this. They had no counter-system for a mine belt 2 million units deep. They had no sensor package capable of tracking 212 coordinated platforms while simultaneously absorbing kinetic impacts and trying to maneuver in a space that was, by then, dense with debris, expanding gas from the vessels they had already lost. The lead vessel went first. It was the largest ship in the armada, a collection tender the analysts had assessed, some 3 kilometers in length, with the characteristic wide-body configuration the Vareth use for their extended harvest platforms. In the months after the engagement, the analyst reconstructed its final 11 minutes from the sensor log data, and what they found was a ship that had been performing its approach duties with complete operational normality. Drive at cruise, arrays extended, harvest systems running their pre-arrival diagnostic cycles, right up until the mine belt's first impacts. It took 11 impacts in the first 4 seconds. By the 5th second, it had lost structural integrity across its primary spine. By the 12th second, the feed marked it as non-functional. I watched the icon change color. I watched it continue, still moving, still carrying its momentum for another 40 seconds before the next impact stopped it entirely. What the feed did not show, and what I have thought about many times since, was what was happening aboard that vessel in those 12 seconds. There were Vareth crew aboard it. Soldiers, engineers, harvest specialists, beings with their own history and culture, and whatever the Vareth equivalent of families are. They had traveled for a very long time to reach this point, following a trail that their records told them was their own. They were not, by their own reckoning, doing anything wrong. They were executing a scheduled return to a catalogued asset. They were doing their jobs. I do not mourn them. I want to be clear about that. I do not mourn the Varath crew. I acknowledge that they existed and that what happened to them was not from inside their own worldview an act of justice. It was, from inside their own worldview, an ambush. A betrayal of what their navigational records told them was friendly space. I acknowledge this because I think clarity is more honest than pretending the engagement had no moral weight on the other side. The moral weight on our side is heavier and older and built from 200,000 years of memory and preparation, and I am entirely confident about which side of it I stand on. But I acknowledge that the weight exists. By the 14th minute, 19 of their 40 vessels were confirmed non-functional. 7 more were damaged to the point of immobility. 11 were still maneuvering, attempting to turn, attempting to reverse course, attempting to find the edge of the corridor and break clear of it. The edge of the corridor has no break. That was one of the things the Pale Corridor Engineering Corps was most proud of. The lateral boundary arrays were specifically designed to catch vessels attempting to flee, and they had been designed by people who understood exactly how a Varath fleet in extremis would try to maneuver. The Corps had war-gamed the escape dynamics across centuries of simulation, identifying the most likely breakout vectors and positioning the lateral systems to cover them. The 11 surviving mobile vessels ran into the lateral arrays within 2 minutes of attempting to break. 7 of them were destroyed in the lateral engagement. 4 survived it with varying degrees of damage, and those 4 turned back into the corridor and continued trying to fight. At the 23rd minute, one of the 4, a small, fast vessel the analysts later classified as a command courier, managed to achieve something remarkable. It broke out of the kinetic engagement zone, slipped through a gap in the tracking coverage created when one of our platforms went dark, and reached clear space. It was outside the corridor. It was technically free. It transmitted for 31 seconds before we caught it. The transmission went out on a frequency we had been monitoring, the Varath Deep Space Communication Band, which our intercept installations had been scanning for as long as the corridor had been active. The content of the transmission was compressed into a format we could not fully decode in real time, but the structure was consistent with a distress and warning signal. The analysts who worked it over in the weeks afterward concluded that it contained at minimum the Armada's navigational record, the trail data that had guided them to Earth, including the beacon signal they had followed, and a sensor log of the engagement in the corridor up to the moment of the courier's escape, possibly more. We do not know exactly how much they got out, because our intercept only captured fragments of the transmission before the jamming. Locked down, we destroyed the courier at the 32nd second of its transmission, 1 pulse from the outer boundary tracking array. It was not a difficult shot. I note this not because the courier's survival was a failure. It was not. The protocol had always acknowledged that some transmissions in some engagements would get out, but because it is the part of the engagement that matters most for what came afterward. The Varath transmission reached deep space. It went somewhere. It was received eventually by whoever the Varath sent to find their armada. We know this because nothing came back. The final tally of the engagement was 39 Varath vessels destroyed or non-functional, and 1 courier destroyed while transmitting. No surviving Varath vessels escaped. No crew recovered. They had not offered to surrender, and we had not had the infrastructure in place to accept one. And I will not pretend that the question of prisoners occupied anyone's attention during the engagement itself. After, yes, there are long arguments in the historical record about what we might have learned from survivors. I think those arguments are reasonable, and I have had them as myself, and I believe that the decision not to prepare prisoner recovery infrastructure was a genuine error, a product of 80,000 years of planning for annihilation and not enough planning for any scenario that did not end in annihilation. But I also know what the Varath came to do. They came to collect. They came with a harvest configuration and a catalog entry that said Earth was theirs. And they came without any communication attempt, without any signal of peaceful intent, without any acknowledgement that the world they were approaching might have changed in 200,000 years. They followed the beacon with the serene confidence of a species that has never once been surprised by what it found at the end of a return voyage. They were surprised. I have looked at the sensor records many times in the years since, and what strikes me most is not the scale of the engagement, not the 40 icons changing color, not the debris field the corridor became, not the numbers. What strikes me is the timing of their first course correction attempt. They began trying to change heading at the 22nd second of the engagement, not the first second, not the 5th, the 22nd. For 21 seconds, the Varath fleet absorbed impacts, registered the activation of 212 weapon platforms, identified the mine belt, saw 3 of their vessels lose structural integrity, and continued on course. I think they did not believe it. I think they looked at the sensor data, and their navigation record said empty space, and their catalog said harvest target. And there was a 21-second gap between what they knew and what was happening to them. 21 seconds in which the machinery of their certainty was grinding against the reality of what Earth had become, and the certainty had not yet yielded. That gap is what 80,000 years of preparation bought, not just the weapons, the disbelief, the inability to process, quickly enough, that the world they owned had become the world that owned them. The aftermath of an engagement like this is not silence. The documentaries always show silence. The quiet of the corridor after the firing stops, the earth behind the viewport, the soft exhale of the watchers. That is not what it was. The aftermath of the Varath engagement was 36 hours of continuous data processing, 18 hours of structural assessment on the platforms that had taken damage, 11 hours of debris trajectory calculation to ensure that the corridor's debris field did not present a hazard to Earth's orbital infrastructure, and 7 continuous days of interagency argument about what to do about the transmission. The transmission argument was the hardest one. The positions were broadly 2. The first position held that the transmission was fragmentary, probably partial, and that even if it was received by whoever the Varath had sent it to, the receiver would not have enough navigational data to identify Earth with precision. The beacon was now off. We had shut it down in the first minute of the engagement, as the protocol specified, and without an active beacon to navigate by. A follow-up Varath force would be working from a degraded trail. The pale corridor could be reset and prepared in the years it would take any follow-up force to arrive. We had handled the armada. We could handle what came next. The second position held that we did not know what was in the transmission. We knew it contained navigational data and sensor logs. We did not know if it contained the beacon's encoded structure, which would tell any competent Varath physicist exactly how the lure had been built. And if they understood how the lure had been built, they would know how the corridor had been built, and the corridor's geometry would not surprise them a second time. I sat in on the argument as a non-voting observer. It is not my role to set policy. My role is to confirm tactical pictures and wait. But I had been at Pale Station for 31 years, and I had opinions. And the senior proctor, a woman named Aldrin, who had been running Lunar Defense Command for 20 years, and who I respected enormously, had asked me to observe and provide an assessment if I had one. When the argument had run its course, she asked me. I told her what I had told myself for 31 years, sitting in the alcove, watching the earth. The catalog entry does not expire. They came once. They will come again. The question is not whether we reset the corridor. We reset the corridor, obviously. That is not a question, but whether we limit ourselves to the corridor. We have been planning for the return of the Varath for 200,000 years. We know they travel in armadas of 40 vessels or fewer, because that is what their harvest route records, the ones we decoded from the fleet's own signal data, indicate. We know their drive physics. We know their engagement doctrine. We have it now, from the sensor logs of the 39 vessels we destroyed. We know where they came from, approximately, because the beacon trail data in the courier's transmission would have included the origin vector. We know where they live. I did not suggest what should be done with that information. That is not a tactical question. It is a question for people with more authority than a retired sergeant major who has been watching a beacon array for 3 decades. But I told Aldrin that the question of the transmission, whether it was partial or complete, whether it gave a follow-up force a navigational solution or not, was less important than the question of what we intended to do with 200,000 years of preparation and the knowledge that the Vareth, wherever they are, now know that Earth is not what their catalog said. She nodded. She thanked me. She told me that the Proctor Council was in agreement on the corridor reset, that the debate on the transmission was productive and would continue at the appropriate authority level, and that my assessment had been noted. 3 months later, I received a message from the Expansion Council, the body responsible for human deep space activity, informing me that a long-range survey mission had been authorized to the origin vector coordinates extrapolated from the Vareth fleet's navigational data. The survey mission would take approximately 40 years. Its objectives were classified above my clearance. I folded the message and put it in my personnel file, where it sits beside 31 years of watch logs. I did not need to know the specifics. I knew what the decision meant. We were not done preparing. We had never been done. Preparation is not a state you reach. It is a practice you maintain indefinitely, for as long as the catalog entries exist. I have never found the engagement satisfying, exactly. Satisfying is the wrong word. When people ask me what it felt like, and many people have asked, in the years since, I tell them that what I felt in the 23 minutes was something very close to nothing. Not numbness, not detachment. The specific emptiness that comes from watching something vast and inevitable complete itself. Something that was set in motion 200,000 years ago, and that has been running, step by careful step ever since. You do not feel triumph watching inevitability resolve. You feel, if you are honest about it, a kind of exhausted recognition. Yes, this is what was coming. Yes, this is how it was always going to go. What I feel when I look at the engagement record now, years later, is something closer to grief. Not for the Vareth, because I have no grief for them. They came to harvest us, and the harvest failed. And I have no obligation to mourn the failure of their intention. But for the 180,000 years of human beings who lived and died in, the long interval between the day the Vareth left and the day the corridor went active, they did not get to see this. They did not get to see the 21 seconds. They built the weapon and the beacon and the kill zone, and they died before the answer came. Generation after generation, the watchkeepers before me, and the engineers before them, and the architects before those, all of them investing in a future they would not witness. That is a very human thing to do. I have thought about this often, sitting in the alcove on level 3, looking at the Earth. It is, I think, the signature of our species, not the warships, not the platforms, not the megacities that rose above the surface in the millennia of the long preparation. Those are symptoms. The signature is the willingness to build for a future you will not live to see, because you believe the future is real, and the threat is real, and the people who come after you will need what you are building. Most species, when pressed, will build for their own generation. Perhaps children's generation, if they are disciplined. The Varath, by the evidence of their own catalog system, built on a planning horizon of 200,000 years, which is longer than most, and which had served them well across whatever history they had accumulated. But they built their plans around the assumption that a cataloged asset stays cataloged. They built for a static universe, one in which the thing they had marked would remain what it was. They did not build for the possibility that the cataloged asset had also been planning quietly for the same 200,000 years. The architects built the beacon not because they expected to be alive when it answered. They built it because they understood that catalog entries do not expire, and that somewhere, at a distance of years beyond anyone's comprehension, a Vareth vessel would eventually orient on the trail and follow it home. The long preparation had real costs. I think about this when people talk about it in heroic terms. The grand sweep of 200,000 years of human readiness, the unbroken chain from the architects to the Pale Station cohort to the corridor's activation. The heroic version is true. It is also incomplete. The costs were real. There were generations, particularly in the middle period of the preparation. The 80,000 years between when the beacon went active and when Earth's warship fleet reached its current scale. When the knowledge of the Vareth threat created genuine social fractures. Societies that organized everything around the long preparation and suppressed other kinds of development, prioritizing the military-industrial dimensions at the expense of other things that communities need. There were centuries of argument about whether the threat was real, whether the beacon was wise, whether drawing the Varath in was better than hoping they had lost the navigational data. There were political movements that rejected the long preparation entirely, that called it a generational imposition. The dead demanding the living organized their lives around a war that might never come. Some of those arguments were right, in partial ways. The costs were real, the impositions were real. And yet the chain held through all of it, not because every generation agreed, but because enough of them, enough of the time, understood that the catalog entry did not expire. The Varath were real. They were coming. The question was only when. The answer was the 18th day of the 4th month of my 31st year at Pale Station at 0412 hours. They were right. They were right about everything. The mathematics completed itself, and the answer came. And 39 Vareth vessels are debris in the Pale Corridor, and one courier's transmission went out. I left Pale Station 6 months after the engagement. My successor is a man named Darren, young enough to be my great-great-grandson, old enough to understand what the posting means. I briefed him thoroughly. 4 days of formal handover. Every system, every protocol, every note I had accumulated in 3 decades. He is steady and careful, and he has the right quality of patience. Not restlessness managed, actual patience. The genuine belief that the waiting is meaningful, that the post matters, that the watch is worth keeping even when nothing happens for decades. He asked me on the last morning of the handover whether I had been afraid. I had not expected that question. The usual questions are about the engagement, what it looked like on the feed, whether the platforms performed as expected, whether the moment of activation felt different from the simulations. Nobody had asked me about fear before. I thought about it for a moment, and I told him the truth. Yes, I had been afraid. Not in the 23 minutes. By then, the machinery was running, and there was nothing to be afraid of in the operational sense. Before, in the 8 minutes between my confirmation and the authorization, when 40 Vareth vessels were moving through a cold corridor, and I was sitting in the alcove with nothing to do but wait. I had been afraid, in those 8 minutes, of 2 things. The first was that the systems would fail, not catastrophically, but enough. A relay, a tracking solution, a mine with a faulty circuit. The second was subtler, and it is the fear I have thought about most in the years since. I was afraid that I would not be calm enough, that the 31 years would not have prepared me adequately for the specific 8 minutes when the preparation actually mattered. That I would say the wrong thing on the channel, or look at the wrong console, or make some small human error that interrupted the machinery precisely when the machinery needed to run cleanly. Darren listened to this. Then he asked me whether those fears had been right. I told him no. The systems performed within the parameters the core had designed for them. The platforms fired on solution. The mine belt activated on schedule. The tracking installations maintained coordination throughout the engagement. And I had been calm. Not because I am a particularly calm person. I am not by nature. I have a temper and I know it. but because 31 years in the alcove had given me a very specific understanding of my role. Confirm the picture, activate the protocol, monitor the outcome, trust the systems that 80,000 years of engineering had produced. That is all the watchkeeper is asked to do, and it is exactly the right amount to ask of one person in the face of something that vast. He nodded. He seemed to find that useful. I told him what I tell everyone I brief for this posting. The watchkeeper's job is not glamorous. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. The corridor did the work. The weapon platforms and the mine belt and the tracking installations and the engineering core that built and maintained them across 80,000 years. They did the work. The watchkeeper confirms the picture and activates the protocol and then monitors the outcome. That is all. And for the 31 years before and after that 23 minutes, the watchkeeper sits in the alcove and looks at the earth and waits. The thing I remember most clearly about the engagement itself is not the 23 minutes on the tactical feed. It is the 8 minutes before 0451, between my confirmation to Carver and the authorization coming through. 8 minutes is a long time when 40 Vareth vessels are moving through a corridor that is not yet active. They were reducing range. Every second they advanced made the fire control solutions cleaner, the kinetic intercept geometry better, the engagement more favorable. But it also meant 40 vessels were getting closer to Earth. And until the authorization came through, the corridor was cold and they were sailing through it unbothered. I sat in the alcove. I watched the Earth. I thought about the watchkeepers who had come before me. I thought about the architects. I thought about the generations who had lived in the tunnels in the early dark years, who had known about the Vareth and feared them, and yet somehow sustained the archive and the project and the intent across 40,000 years before the surface was habitable again. I thought about the first cohort of watchkeepers, stationed here when the beacon went active 80,000 years ago, who had sat in whatever passed for an alcove in the original station, and watched the Earth and waited. I thought they would have wanted to see this. At 451, the authorization came through. At 0452, the corridor went active. I watched the feed for 23 minutes, and then it was over, and I went back to the alcove and looked at the Earth. It did not look different. It never does from here. The same blue arc, the same slow turn, the megacities visible as lit patches on the night side, the orbital platforms crossing the terminator, the warships in the high orbits barely visible as moving points of light against the stars. It looked exactly like Earth always looks from the moon's far side, patient and enormous and entirely itself. That is the thing, I think. That is the thing the Varath did not understand, could not have understood, because their records said catalog entry, and their catalog was 200,000 years old, and the world in front of them did not match anything they had ever encountered. The thing is that Earth does not announce itself. It does not broadcast what it has become. It is simply there, patient and enormous, turning in its orbit, doing what it has always done, sustaining the people on it and around it, while those people, with the slow, determined discipline of a species that remembers everything, prepare. The Varath followed the beacon because they trusted their records. The records were right. Earth was exactly where the records said. The trail was real. The approach was correct. What was waiting at the end of it, that was different. Darren wrote to me 6 weeks after I handed over the posting. A brief message. He is not a voluble person, which is a quality I respect in a watchkeeper. He told me the corridor had been fully reset and the new platform configurations were online. He told me the debris field had been cleared to within acceptable hazard margins. He told me the beacon would remain offline pending the Proctor Council's decision on whether to rebuild it in a modified configuration. He also told me that the Level 3 alcove was, in his opinion, the best place on the station to see the Earth. I wrote back and told him I agreed, and that he should spend as much time there as his duties allowed. There is very little else to say. The engagement is on record. The protocols are on record. The 200,000 years of preparation are on record. insofar as records survive that long. Some of them do, in the deep archive, where the original architect documents sit in translation alongside the raw physics work and the beacon engineering notes, and the kill zone design files. I have read some of them. They are dry and technical, and occasionally, without intending to be, they are extraordinary. A calculation written 200,000 years ago by a person who understood the Varath drive physics well enough to encode a perfect forgery, who knew the forgery would not be used in their lifetime or their children's lifetime or for thousands of generations to come, who encoded it anyway, precisely, correctly, and handed it forward. I do not know that person's name. The archive has gaps. What I know is that they were a physicist and an engineer and a human being who looked at the fact of the Varath's departure and decided that the appropriate response was to spend their working life building a trap for the return voyage. They were right. The return voyage happened. The trap held. And somewhere out there, in the deep space between here and wherever the Varath came from, the courier's transmission is still traveling, a compressed distress signal, a navigational record, a sensor log of 23 minutes of what happens when you catalog a world and come back 200,000 years later expecting to find the same thing you left. I think about whoever receives it. I think about the moment they read the sensor log and understand what the feed shows. 40 vessels entering a corridor, and 23 minutes later, 0. I think about the 21 seconds and whether they will understand what those 21 seconds mean. If they are wise, they will understand. If they are wise, they will read the sensor log and the navigational record, and they will grasp that the beacon was not a residual trail, but an invitation, and they will calculate backwards from the trap to the builders, and they will come to the same conclusion the Varath armada came to at the 22nd second of the engagement. Too late and too little and far too wrong. If they are wise, they will not come back. I am 93 years old. I have left Pale Station for the last time, though I expect Darren will invite me back for the dedication of the new observation deck, which is apparently scheduled for next spring. I live now in the coastal city where I was born, which is very large and very loud, and not at all like the quiet of the moon, and I am working through the adjustment with the stubbornness that is, I have been told, my primary character trait. From my apartment, I cannot see the moon on most nights. Light interference from the city makes it pale and indistinct, but I know it is there. I know the alcove is there, and the array, and Darren in his chair, watching the earth. I know the corridor has been reset. I know the work continues. That is what it means to be ready, not the engagement, not the 23 minutes. The work continues always, because the catalog entries do not expire, and somewhere beyond the limit of our current reach, there are other catalogs, other entries, other return voyages being planned by species that do not yet know what Earth has become. They will find out. We have been getting ready for a very long time. The architect who built the first beacon are 200,000 years dead. The watchkeepers who came before me are dust. The engineers who constructed the original platforms, who tested the first mine arrays, who argued over the tracking installation geometries in the tunnels of the early preparation years. They are all gone, and they left their work behind them, because they understood that the work matters more than the worker, and the future matters more than the present, and a species that can hold a purpose across 200,000 years, and a kill zone in the pale corridor and a 21-second gap in a returning armada's reaction time. That species is not catalogued anymore. That species is not a harvest. That species is not a dormant asset on a return schedule. We are not finished.